Yesterday we spoke about the first Beis Hamikdash and how the nature of the first Beis Hamikdash was a place of incredible divine experience. It was all, so to speak, on Hashem's terms. It was His instruction, it was His revelation, it was His miracles, and that was an incredible thing to have the opportunity to experience. But as we've just seen in the Hayom Yom, when things come to us from the outside, even if it's from Hashem Himself, it's never as lasting as something that you have to work through with your own effort. And so as a result of that, the first Beis Hamikdash ended up being destroyed, primarily because the people had lost interest, because the people lost the sense of wonder at the value of the Beis Hamikdash, and things, so to speak, fell apart. They went into the Babylonian exile, and they spent around about 70 years in the Babylonian exile, and only after that was there a groundswell movement from the people themselves to say, we need to go back. We need to re-establish ourselves in Israel, and we need to build a second Beis Hamikdash. So in order to do that, everything was different. The first Beis Hamikdash was Hashem's instruction. This was their own initiative. The first Beis Hamikdash happened at a time that the Jews had sovereign control over Israel. The second Beis Hamikdash was a group of people who were living in a foreign country in Babylon, who wanted to go back home to be able to build the Beis Hamikdash, but couldn't do so on their own. They had to have, it's called Babylon, but actually it had become part of the Persian Empire. So they had to have the buy-in and the support and permission from the Persian leadership to be able to go back. Because Israel fell under the Persian Empire. They had to have permission to go back and to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. So it's not like, so to speak, on Hashem's terms. They had to work through the political channels to be able to be in a position to do what they had to do. The first Beis Hamikdash was in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, who, in addition to the fact that he was a tremendous leader and had the largest Jewish empire and the largest influence over the rest of the world, he was also very wealthy. And so the first Beis Hamikdash was built in grand style, incredibly beautiful, with a lot of gold and all kinds of marble, and it was absolutely magnificent. When they went back to build the second Beis Hamikdash, they were effectively a destitute community who really couldn't afford to make a beautiful Beis Hamikdash at all. They had to just make do with whatever they could make do with, and to build it at that point in a relatively modest way. Years later, already in the beginning of the Roman era, that's when you would have Herod rebuild and upgrade the Beis Hamikdash into the picture that we have of the Beis Hamikdash. And when you go on those Kotel tunnel tours, and when you look at the architecture that's left today in Jerusalem, a lot of that is Herodian. But when they originally went back to build the second Beis Hamikdash, it was a far more modest experience. So the second Beis Hamikdash seems to be altogether different from the first. The first is what we call Isarusa Dile'ela, where the initiative comes from on high, where everything is driven by Hashem in His magnificent fashion, as opposed to the second Beis Hamikdash, which is what we call Isarusa Dilesata, an initiative that comes from below, human-driven, which, needless to say, has all kinds of limitations. And so the structure that they built ended up being initially a less spectacular structure. As I say, later on in history, not only Herod, there were other people also who contributed to various facets of the Second Temple, and it actually ended up becoming quite a magnificent building in the long run. But the initial experience was quite modest, and not everybody bought in. There were big segments of the Jewish community who did not participate. The second Beis Hamikdash also had a very significant difference to the first. What's the difference? The first Beis Hamikdash, as we learned yesterday, there was miracle after miracle. You walked in over there and you saw things happening in front of your eyes that were the most spectacular things that indicated very clearly that this is a place of divine revelation. And that's not to say that in the second Beis Hamikdash there were not miracles. There were some incredible things that happened. You hear the description, for example, of the celebration of Simchas Beis HaShoeva, which was during the holiday of Sukkot, where they'd have these night-long celebrations. The biggest simcha, so much so that the Gemara says if you had never seen Simchas Beis HaShoeva, you had never seen simcha in your life. And you read the eyewitness accounts from the people who lived at that period of time, and how they had these very tall masts, which they used as floodlights in order to illuminate the area. And then you read the story of how the Kohanim would schlep up liters and liters of oil at once, that climb up these poles. I mean, it's unusual things. So there were still experiences, there were still miracles, there were still great things that happened. But there were a number of things that were missing from the second Beis Hamikdash that had been present in the first and were not present in the second. In fact, we're told of 5 things that were missing in the second Beis Hamikdash. And probably the most notable, not probably, definitely the most notable of them all is there was no ark. So the whole Beis Hamikdash is centered on the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the portal of connection between Hashem and us. So when the Jews were in the desert and they had the portable Mishkan, all the messaging that came to Moshe came through the Holy of Holies, and specifically came through the Keruvim, the angelic figures that were on top of the golden ark. In the first Beis Hamikdash, you had this wonderful experience that on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would go into the Holy of Holies and he would commune with Hashem in the environment of that ark. Prior to the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, when the writing was already on the wall, they hid that ark so that no foreign country, no foreign power should ever be able to have access to the ark. And when Shlomo HaMelech, when King Solomon had designed the Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount is itself a structure, right? On top of the hill, it's actually made into a squared off structure. So he designed it with a whole labyrinth of mazes underneath the ground, and somewhere in there they hid the Aron, the ark. So that was never retrieved, and the second Beis Hamikdash, the Holy of Holies, sat empty. Sat empty. It's an incredible thing to imagine. And in fact, what they did is on the back wall, they depicted the scene of these Kruvim, of these angels, to kind of remind people of what had once been there. So not to have that ark in the Beis Hamikdash is a major element that was missing, which, by the way, may actually explain how it is that the Rambam and others will tell you that the primary feature of the Beis Hamikdash is sacrifices, not the so-called portal of connection and the place of the divine presence, because otherwise the second Beis Hamikdash seems to be disqualified. It had the opportunity to bring sacrifices. It did not have that incredible presence of Hashem. As a direct result of that, and very closely related to that, we know that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had to wear a certain uniform, and on his uniform was something called the Choshen, the breastplate. And behind that Choshen breastplate there was a little flap, and inside that flap was a piece of parchment called the Urim V'Tumim, which allowed, again, divine messaging to come through. So the different stones would light up and they had letters on them, and that would be a way for the Kohen Gadol to get messages on behalf of the community or on behalf of the king. In the second Beis Hamikdash, although you had to have all of the components of the uniform, including the breastplate, it did not have the Urim V'Tumim. So they also lacked that level of communication from Hashem. So if you had to do a comparison, the first Beis Hamikdash was definitely a more spiritual experience and a more otherworldly experience than the second Beis Hamikdash was. On the other hand, over the course of time, as the second Beis Hamikdash was renovated, it eventually landed up being a larger building than the first. So that's interesting. The physical space, the physical area and size of the second Beis Hamikdash landed up being larger than the first. The second thing that is interesting is that the second Beis Hamikdash stood for longer than the first Beis Hamikdash. Not much longer. The first Beis Hamikdash stood for 410 years and this 420 years. But still, it stood for longer. Which implies that the second Beis Hamikdash, there is less emphasis on its spiritual nature. The first Beis Hamikdash is very much about its spiritual nature and about what Hashem plugged into the system. The second Beis Hamikdash seems to have greater effects in its physical nature, larger and longer. Those are physical measurements, which makes sense because the second Beis Hamikdash is about human endeavor. It was a volunteer program that the people came up with of their own accord, that they had to go fundraise for, that they had to get the political buy-in, and then could actually go and build this thing. So that's human endeavor. Human endeavor will express itself mainly in physical things. When Hashem does something, it expresses itself in spiritual things. When a human does something, it expresses itself in physical things. So now you have to ask yourself the question, out of the two Batei Mikdash, out of the two temples, which one's better? Is it better to have a Beis Hamikdash where everything is, so to speak, flowing from Hashem, and it's Hashem's input, and it's grand, and it's spiritual, and it's miraculous? Or is it better to have a Beis Hamikdash that is about human endeavor, and we slog, and we put in the effort, and as a result of that, we achieve something? And the answer is, it depends what you're trying to measure. If the goal of the Beis Hamikdash is divine presence, then the first Beis Hamikdash is for sure streets ahead, because the extent of divine presence that is supposed to have been there, it achieved. But if you're measuring impact in the so-called real world, if you're measuring impact on the physical, the second Beis Hamikdash is greater. Because the impact on the physical, not only is it because it's a larger structure, and not only because it lasts for a longer time, but most importantly, because the impact was obviously on the people themselves. They themselves felt the buy-in. They felt ownership over this thing. So they came forward. So if the goal of the Beis Hamikdash is korban, to bring yourself forward, to bring yourself towards Hashem, well, then the second Beis Hamikdash is the better. So each one of them has an advantage the other does not have, and therefore, by extension, each one has a disadvantage. The advantage of the first Beis Hamikdash is revelation. The disadvantage is doesn't have as strong and profound an impact in the here and now. The advantage of the second Beis Hamikdash is the impact on the here and now. The disadvantage is it lacks the same degree of revelation. That's why neither of them could last. Because you cannot have a system that lasts if it only succeeds in one of the two major areas that Hashem has designed. And that's why we say Sheyibane Beis Hamikdash, that we ask Hashem for the third Beis Hamikdash, because the goal of the third Beis Hamikdash will be an entity that has both advantages. The highest level of divine input, the highest level of revelation, and the greatest degree of absorbing, the greatest degree of impact on the physical world. Therefore, the third Beis Hamikdash, because it will harmonize both values, the greatest heights and the most profound impact, therefore it will last forever and never be destroyed, because it has none of the disadvantage. Please God, we should see that Beis Hamikdash immediately with the coming of Mashiach.